The bullet that killed Maude Aldridge's husband missed her by less than 3 inches, and the man who rode up to help her was a stranger with sun-cracked hands and kind eyes who asked for nothing and stayed anyway. That was the summer of 1882, when the dust in Crockett County, Texas, rose in red columns against a sky so blue it looked painted, and the heat pressed down on everything like a hand that intended to keep the land flat and the people humble. The Santa Fe Railroad had been pushing its iron veins westward for years by then, and with it came all manner of men, some looking to build something and some looking to take what others had built. Maude had married young, at 18, to a man named Roy Aldridge who was 24 and full of plans. He had plans for cattle, plans for a homestead out near the Pecos River, where the grass was brown but present, and the water could be coaxed from the earth with enough will and enough rope. He had plans for a family, and he had plans for a future, and all of those plans came apart on a Tuesday morning in June, when 2 riders from the Kettner outfit decided that Roy's fence line was an insult to their employer's range, and they expressed that feeling with Winchester rifles. Maude was 22 when Roy died. She was 5 feet and 4 inches of hard-won composure. With dark hair she wore pinned against the back of her neck in the heat, and brown eyes that had the peculiar quality of looking directly at things most people looked away from. She had grown up in San Antonio, the daughter of a German immigrant father who ran a dry goods store and a Mexican mother who had died of fever when Maude was 9. She had learned English, German, and Spanish in that order, and she had learned practical things, how to keep accounts, how to preserve food through a long summer, how to stretch $1 until it begged for mercy. She had not learned how to be helpless, and she refused to learn it now, even with Roy's blood drying in the Texas dirt and 2 horses disappearing over the ridge. She loaded Roy into the wagon herself. It took her the better part of an hour because Roy had been a big man and grief was making her hands shake. She had just gotten him settled in the wagon bed when she heard hooves on the road, and her hand went to the rifle she had leaned against the wagon wheel. The rider came around the bend at an easy pace, a bay horse with a white blaze on its nose, and the man in the saddle sat easy the way men do when they've spent more of their life on horseback than off it. He was perhaps 27, 28, with a face that the sun had worked on considerably lean through the jaw, with dark blonde hair under a well-used hat. He wore a canvas shirt and trail-worn trousers and carried a Winchester in a scabbard on his saddle, which was not unusual for a man riding through Crockett County in 1882. He also wore a lawman's star on his chest, which was a ranger's badge, and that was the first thing Maude noticed after she noticed his eyes, which were gray and careful and did not miss the blood on her skirt or the body in the wagon. He stopped his horse 20 feet from the wagon and kept his hands visible. That told her he had some sense. "Ma'am," he said, "I am Texas Ranger John Alden. I was riding from Fort Stockton to Sanderson and I saw the buzzards starting to circle. I am sorry for whatever's happened here. Are you injured?" "I am not," Maude said. She lowered the rifle but did not set it down. "My husband is dead, shot by 2 men from the Kettner outfit. They rode northeast when they left." John Alden's jaw tightened. He dismounted in one smooth motion, dropped his reins to the ground, and approached with his hat in his hand, the way a man approaches something that needs handling carefully. He looked at Roy in the wagon, looked at the blood on the earth, looked at the fence line and the cut wire, and she could see him reading the scene the way she might read a ledger, columns of evidence adding up to a sum. "You got them identified?" he asked. "I know one by name, Pete Rourke. Roy had dealings with him before when Kettner first started pressing on the fence line. The other man I do not know, younger, red hair." "I know Pete Rourke," John said, and his voice went quiet in a particular way. "He is a bad man to have for an enemy, Mrs. Aldridge." "My husband is dead," Maude said. "I believe that particular point has already been made." Something shifted in his expression. It was not pity exactly. It was something more careful than pity, respect perhaps for the steel in her voice when her world had just come apart. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "It has. Where are you trying to get to?" "Sweetwater Creek. There is a town there. I need to get Roy to proper burial, and then I need to talk to the county sheriff about what I intend to do." "What do you intend to do?" She looked at him directly. "I intend to keep my land." John Alden put his hat back on his head. He looked northeast, where the Kettner men had gone. He looked at the wagon and at the road to Sweetwater Creek, and then he looked back at Maude. "Sweetwater Creek is 14 miles, he said. "And Pete Rourke knows this road. You should not make that drive alone." "I have driven 14 miles before," Maude said. "Yes, ma'am, I don't doubt it." He looked at the bay horse and then back at her. "I would ride with you if you'll allow it. I am going that direction anyway, and it would ease my mind considerably to know you arrived safely." Maude studied him. He was holding his hat and looking at her with those careful gray eyes that did not assume things, which was already more than most men managed. "Why would you ride out of your way for a stranger?" "I don't count the distance that way, Mrs. Aldridge," he said. "I'd just be riding. You'd be the one doing something hard." She did not quite understand what he meant by that, but she was tired and Roy was growing heavier in her heart with every passing moment, and she had 14 miles of road ahead of her in the summer heat with buzzards overhead. "Get your horse," she said. He rode beside the wagon the whole 14 miles, and he did not fill the silence with meaningless words, which she appreciated. He did speak when there was something worth saying. He told her, factually and without drama, that he had been a Texas Ranger for 4 years, that he was out of the company stationed at Fort Stockton, and that the Kettner outfit had been under investigation for range expansion by means that the law did not sanction. He said this plainly, as though he were explaining a situation to a colleague rather than comforting a widow, and Maude found that she preferred it to sympathy. She told him about the homestead, 240 acres, water rights to a creek branch, good grass if you managed it, and a small herd that was only starting to show the work Roy had put into building it. She told him this plainly too, looking at the road ahead while the wagon wheels turned in the red dust. "He worked himself to the bone for that land," she said. 3 years. We came out from San Antonio with almost nothing and built it up. I am not leaving it." "You mentioned that," John said. "I intend to keep on mentioning it until people stop looking at me like I might change my mind." He made a sound that was almost a laugh, not a mocking sound, something quieter and genuinely amused. "I don't think people looking at you changes your mind much, Mrs. Aldridge." "No," she said, "it does not." They reached Sweetwater Creek in the late afternoon, when the light was going gold and the shadows of the single main street stretched long across the packed dirt. The town was small but not negligible. It had a post office, a dry goods store, a livery stable, a saloon, a doctor's office, and a proper church with a bell tower. The undertaker's establishment was at the end of the street, and John Alden rode ahead and spoke to the man there before Maude had brought the wagon fully to a stop, so that when she climbed down, things were already being arranged, and she did not have to negotiate them through her grief. She noticed that. She noticed it, and she filed it away, and she did not know what to do with it. The county sheriff was a man named Amos Greer, which was an unfortunate name for a man whose ambitions did not extend much beyond keeping his desk tidy and the Kettner outfit from causing him direct inconvenience. He was 50, heavy through the middle with a mustache that had gone mostly gray, and he listened to Maude's account of what had happened with the expression of a man who has already decided what he is going to do before anyone finishes talking. "Mrs. Aldridge," he said when she was done, "this is a serious matter, very serious. I will look into it thoroughly." "Pete Rourke," she said. "And a younger man, red-haired, from the Kettner outfit. I will make inquiries." "You will make arrests," she said. Sheriff Greer's expression shifted into something that tried to look kindly and only managed condescending. "Mrs. Aldridge, you have been through a terrible ordeal today and you should rest. These things take time. The law moves carefully." "The law moved carefully enough that my husband is dead," she said. She was standing in the sheriff's office with the late afternoon sun coming through the single window, and her dress was still blood-stained at the hem, and she looked at Amos Greer with those dark eyes that did not flinch, and Greer looked back at her with the comfortable certainty of a man who believed that widows eventually went away. John Alden was standing by the door. He had come in quietly and was listening with an expression that did not reveal much, except that his jaw was set in the same tight way it had been when she named Pete Rourke. After Maude walked out, John stayed for another moment. She did not hear what he said to Greer, but when he came out into the street, his badge caught the last of the sunlight, and she thought that a ranger's authority was a different thing from a county sheriff's comfort, and perhaps that would matter. The Sweetwater Creek Hotel was a two-story wood-frame building that had seen better times, but it had clean linens and a lock on the door. Maude paid for a room from the money she kept in a small purse beneath her skirt. Roy had always said to keep your real money where trouble couldn't easily reach it, and she sat on the bed in the narrow room and let herself cry for exactly 1 hour. She was precise about this because she knew herself well enough to know that if she did not set a limit, the grief would take her down into a depth from which she might not surface in time to fight for what needed fighting. After 1 hour, she washed her face with the water from the basin, changed into her one clean dress from her bag, pinned her hair back firmly, and went downstairs to the small dining room for supper. John Alden was there at the corner table with a cup of coffee and a plate of beans, and he looked up when she came in with the same careful gray eyes and said, "Mrs. Aldridge, would you care to sit?" She sat because she was tired, and because he was the only person in Sweetwater Creek she trusted even marginally, which was not a high bar but was the bar she had. He ordered her a meal without asking what she wanted. He asked the woman behind the counter for whatever was hot and brought coffee without ceremony. And Maude noticed that he did not hover over her or watch her face for signs of impending collapse, which almost every other man she had encountered in her life seemed to feel was necessary when a woman had experienced difficulty. He ate his beans and she ate her beans, and she asked him what he had said to Greer. "I told him that the Ranger Company has an active interest in the Kettner outfit," John said, "that the situation at the Aldridge homestead is relevant to a larger investigation, that I would be filing a report to headquarters and that headquarters would expect a response from his office." "Will that work?" "It will make him nervous," John said, "which is useful. I cannot force him to act quickly, but I can make him uncomfortable enough that he acts." "How long?" she asked. 2 weeks, maybe 3. I need to ride to Fort Stockton and file my report. Then I need to come back and coordinate with Greer or go around him if he continues to be useless. He drank his coffee. "You should not go back to the homestead alone while Pete Rourke is at large." "It is my homestead," she said. "Yes, ma'am, I know it is. I have a herd there, 20 head of cattle. They need attending. Is there anyone you trust in this town? Anyone who could ride out with you or who you could stay with temporarily?" She thought about it. She did not know Sweetwater Creek well. She and Roy had traded at the store a few times, and she knew the storekeeper by name, a man called Hiram Foster, who had always been fair in his dealings. She knew the woman who ran the hotel. She did not know anyone well enough to call them a friend. "There is the preacher," she said. "Reverend Mills." Roy respected him. He might know of someone. "Good." John set down his coffee cup. "I will speak with Reverend Mills in the morning, and I will ask around about accommodations for you that are more secure than a hotel room while we sort out this business." He paused. "There is a family about a mile east of town, the Harker family, who have a decent reputation and have been known to take in temporary boarders. I passed their place on the way in. Would you be willing to board there for a few weeks?" Maude looked at her plate and then at him. "Mr. Alden," she said, "you are taking considerable trouble over a woman you have known for 6 hours." He looked at her steadily. "Mrs. Aldridge," he said, "I am doing my job." But his job had not required him to keep his horse even with her wagon for 14 miles of dusty road. His job had not required him to speak to the undertaker before she climbed down, or to order her supper without making her ask. She thought about saying this and then did not, because she was too tired and too sad, and there would be time to be confounded by John Alden later. "I will speak with the Harker family," she said. "And I appreciate it, Mr. Alden." He nodded, and they finished their supper in the companionable silence of two people who have agreed, at least temporarily, on the direction they are traveling. The Harker family turned out to be exactly what John had said they were: decent people with a solid farmstead, and a guest room off the kitchen that had belonged to a daughter now married and living in Abilene. Martha Harker was a square, direct woman of about 45 with flour on her hands and warmth in her eyes, and she looked at Maude's situation with the practical sympathy of someone who had seen hard times herself and come through them. "You stay as long as you need," Martha said, over coffee at the kitchen table, while her husband Ben nodded from behind his newspaper. "We will not crowd you." Maude thanked her and meant it. Roy's funeral was held 2 days after they arrived in Sweetwater Creek. Reverend Mills read from Job and from the Psalms, and Maude stood at the graveside in the full morning sun and held herself together with both hands, metaphorically speaking. John Alden stood slightly to her left and slightly behind her, not touching her, not speaking, just present in the quiet way that she was beginning to recognize as his particular way of being in the world. After the burial, he came to her and said he needed to ride to Fort Stockton to file his report. He would be gone 10 days, perhaps 12. "I will be back," he said. "Before I come back I will send word." "You do not need to come back," she said. "I understand that your official business will be concluded." He looked at her for a moment. "My official business with Greer will be concluded when Pete Rourke is in custody and you have some protection of your land rights under the law," he said. "I am not done." Maude looked at this man, this careful, steady, sun-worn man who had appeared on the road to Sweetwater Creek with nowhere in particular to be, and had redirected himself entirely around her difficulty, without once making it seem like a burden. She felt something she was not ready to name, and she put it away carefully in the same mental place where she put things that needed to wait. "Ride safe, Mr. Alden," she said. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "I intend to." He rode out in the early morning, and the dusk closed over the road behind him, and Maude turned back to the business of being alive. She was not idle in those 10 days. She rode out to the homestead twice, each time with Ben Harker riding alongside to check on the cattle and make sure nothing had been disturbed. The 20 head were still there, grazing with bovine indifference to the human drama that had claimed their owner. The cabin was locked. The fences were as she had left them, except for the section the Kettner men had cut, which she and Ben repaired on the second trip with wire and sweat, and a pair of pliers that had belonged to Roy. She also spent an afternoon with the Sweetwater Creek land agent, a Faraday man named Dunn, who showed her the deed to the Aldridge homestead and confirmed that it was, legally and properly, in the names of both Roy Aldridge and Maude Aldridge jointly, and that on Roy's death the property passed entirely to her. She had Roy's will too, handwritten and witnessed by 2 men in San Antonio, leaving everything to her. She had known this was the case, but she wanted a lawyer to know it too, and she wanted it on record in the county office that Mrs. Maude Aldridge was the legal owner of the Aldridge homestead, full stop, and she was not selling or surrendering any part of it. Dunn made the record with the expression of a man handling something slightly distasteful, but he made it because the law was the law and her papers were proper. John Alden came back on the 11th day, not the 12th, which suggested that he had ridden harder than necessary. He arrived at the Harker farm in the late afternoon, while Maude was in the kitchen garden pulling weeds, not because she was required to, but because keeping her hands busy kept her mind from circling the same dark territory too many times. She heard the hooves on the road and looked up, and there was the bay horse with the white blaze, and the man on it with the sun behind him and the ranger's star catching the light. She stood up from the garden and dusted her hands on her apron, and she was annoyed to find that something in her chest had unclenched at the sight of him. "Mr. Alden," she said as he dismounted at the fence. "Mrs. Aldridge," he said, "you look well." "I am well enough," she said. "Come inside, Martha will have coffee." He sat at the Harker kitchen table and told her what had happened at Fort Stockton. His captain, a man named Reeves, had been interested in Maude's account of the events. Pete Rourke was already on the Ranger Company's list as a known enforcer for the Kettner outfit, connected to 2 other incidents of fence-cutting and intimidation of homesteaders in the area. The pattern was clear. The Rangers were now officially involved, not just as a courtesy but as an active investigation. "They are sending 2 more Rangers to Crockett County," John said, "to coordinate with Greer and to make contact with the other homesteaders who have been pressed by Kettner and Rourke. There is a warrant being prepared. It will take a few more days to process through the county, but Greer knows it is coming. He cannot stall the way he might have without Ranger involvement." Maude nodded. "Good," she said. She wrapped her hands around her coffee cup and stared at the table for a moment. "And what about Kettner himself? The men who pulled triggers were Rourke and the red-haired one, but the orders came from somewhere." "Yes," John said. "That is the longer work. Kettner is a wealthy man with connections in Austin. Taking down the men on the ground is the first step. Building a case against the man who employs them is harder and slower. But it can be done." "It can be done," he said. "I intend to see it done." Maude looked at him across the table. In the warm afternoon light of the Harker kitchen, with the smell of coffee and the sound of Martha moving in the next room, John Alden looked tired in the specific way of a man who has been sleeping in a bedroll and eating trail food and riding long miles in the Texas summer. He also looked entirely at ease, the way a man is at ease when he is exactly where he is supposed to be. She said something then that she had not planned to say, because the thought surprised her on its way out of her mouth. "Why are you doing all of this?" she said. "Beyond the official duty, you are a Texas Ranger. There is official duty, and then there is whatever this is, riding 11 days instead of 12, coming back to a farming kitchen, staying on a problem past where the report is filed." He was quiet for a moment, turning his coffee cup in his hands. He had large hands. She had noticed, not rough in the careless way, but rough in the earned way, the hands of someone who worked. "I am going to be honest with you," he said, "because you are a woman who seems to prefer it. The official duty matters to me. I would be back here regardless because the investigation is ongoing and there is work to do." But he stopped. He looked at his coffee. "I also wanted to see that you were all right." It was a plain thing to say, and he said it plainly, and that was somehow far more dangerous than if he had been eloquent about it. "I am all right," she said. "I can see that," he said, and he smiled briefly, a small private smile. I did not doubt it either. The weeks that followed had a structure to them that Maude had not anticipated. John was working riding between Sweetwater Creek and the surrounding homesteads, gathering testimony from the other small ranchers and farmers who had been pressured by the Kettner outfit, coordinating with the 2 additional Rangers who arrived from Fort Stockton, and managing the increasingly uncomfortable Sheriff Greer. But he was also, consistently and without drawing attention to it, present. He ate supper at the Harker table 3 or 4 evenings a week. He helped Ben Harker with a fence repair one Saturday afternoon without being asked, noticing that Ben's hip was troubling him and that the post-work was heavy. He brought Maude a book from the dry goods store, a novel, Walter Scott. She had mentioned once in passing that she liked to read, and left it on the kitchen table with no note. She knew it was from him because there was no one else it could have been from. She started to look for him without meaning to. She would be in the garden, or sitting on the Harker porch in the evening when the heat broke slightly, and she would be aware of the road in a new way, aware of the sound of a particular horse. She told herself this was practical. She told herself that, in a situation as precarious as hers, knowing the location of your only reliable ally was a matter of self-preservation, not sentiment. She was not sure she believed herself entirely. One evening, about 3 weeks after his return from Fort Stockton, they sat on the porch after supper. Martha and Ben had gone inside, Martha pleading a headache and Ben following his wife with the practiced consideration of a man who knows when privacy is being provided. The sun had gone down, but the sky was still a deep lavender, and the first stars were beginning, and the smell of the land in the evening was sage and dust, and something green that came from the creek a quarter-mile west. "Tell me about yourself," Maude said. "We have talked about nothing but the investigation for 3 weeks." John looked at the evening sky. "Not much to tell," he said. "That is never true," she said. "Are you from?" "Missouri originally, small town in the western part of the state near Joplin. My father was a farmer. My mother taught school before she married him. I have 2 brothers, both still in Missouri, both farmers. I came south when I was 19, ended up in Texas somehow." "Somehow," she said. "That is doing a lot of work." He smiled. "I was following a girl," he said. "She came to Texas to marry a man in San Antonio, and I was young and stupid and rode south after her. She married the other man. I found myself in San Antonio with no prospects and an excess of pride, and a ranger recruiter at the bar told me I looked like a man who needed a direction." "And that was your direction." "It turned out to suit me," he said. "I am good at looking at a situation and understanding what is happening in it. I am patient. I do not mind the writing." He paused. "The girl, I am grateful it went the way it did, if that makes sense. She was not wrong to choose the other man. We wanted different things, and I did not know that then, but I know it now." Maude looked at the darkening sky. A nighthawk was cutting arcs overhead, catching insects. "Roy and I met in San Antonio," she said. "He came into my father's store to buy flour and oats, and he talked to me for half an hour about his plans for the homestead, and I thought, here is a man who believes in things. That was what I liked about him. He was full of belief." She paused. "He was right about the land, too. It is good land. It can support a real operation if it is managed well." "You believe that?" John said. It was not a question. "I do. I lived there 3 years. I know the soil and the grass and the water." "Roy had good instincts for cattle. I have good instincts for the operation side of it, the accounts, the timing of sales, the relationships with the buyers. Together we were building something real." "And alone," he said. She met his eyes. "Alone I can still build something real. It will take longer and be harder, but I am not willing to give it up because it is hard." He looked at her for a long moment in the last of the lavender light. His expression had the quality she had come to associate with him, the careful attention, the absence of assumption, the sense that he was hearing not just what she was saying but the full structure of the person saying it. "I know you are not," he said. There was a silence between them that was different from the usual silence. She was aware of it as a kind of weather, the specific pressure before something shifts. She was the one who broke it because she was, at her core, a practical woman. "It is getting late," she said. "You should get some sleep. You have an early ride tomorrow." "Yes," he said. He stood and put his hat on, and the ranger's star caught the porch light. "Good night, Mrs. Aldridge." "Good night, Mr. Alden," she said. And she watched him go to the barn where Ben had given him a cot, and she sat on the porch for another few minutes in the warm night, listening to the nighthawk, feeling the specific ache of being alone in a world that kept on being beautiful. The warrant for Pete Rourke came through on a Thursday in late July. John rode out with the 2 other rangers, a man named Calder and a man named Briggs, and Sheriff Greer rode along because it was technically his jurisdiction, and he needed to be seen participating. They found Rourke at the Kettner Ranch, which was 11 miles northeast of Sweetwater Creek, in a bunkhouse full of hands who mostly looked at the ground when the rangers arrived. Maude was not there for the arrest. She was at the homestead, where she had moved back 10 days earlier, with an arrangement where Ben Harker's eldest son, a solid young man of 20 named Will, came over every other morning to help with the cattle. She had her rifle and her nerve and the legal paperwork for the land all in a tin box under her bed, and she was pulling the homestead back into the shape it needed to be in. She heard about the arrest from John when he came by on the Friday. He tied his horse at her fence and came to the cabin door with his hat in his hand, and she opened the door and saw from his face that the news was good. "Rourke is in Sweetwater Creek Jail," he said. "Calder got the red-haired 1-2 name of Denny Walsh." They are both charged with the murder of Roy Aldridge and with multiple counts of trespass and property destruction. Maude pressed her hand briefly to the door frame, just briefly. Then she said, "Come in. I have coffee." He came in and she gave him coffee, and he sat at her kitchen table, Roy's kitchen table, the one they had hauled out from San Antonio in the wagon, and he told her the rest of it. The case against Kettner himself was building. 2 other homesteaders had come forward with testimony after the Rangers made contact. A land agent in Fort Stockton had provided records showing that Kettner had been attempting to file fraudulent claims on properties that were already legally held by other parties. The Rangers and the county land office were working with the state attorney in Austin. "It will take time," John said. "Kettner has money and lawyers. But he is in the position of defending himself on multiple fronts now, and he knows it." "And Rourke, Walsh?" Maude asked. "They will stand trial. The evidence is solid. You will be called as a witness, Mrs. Aldridge." "I know," she said. "I am prepared for it." He looked around the cabin. She had been cleaning and rearranging, putting it back in working order, and it showed. The windows were clean. There was a pot of something on the stove. The floor had been swept. "You have made this comfortable," he said. "It is not comfortable yet," she said, "but it will be. I have a list of what needs doing. The south fence needs attention. The spring house door is rotting at the bottom, and I need 2 more heifers before fall if the herd is going to be in proper shape for next year." He was watching her with that expression, the careful, attending expression, and there was something in it now that she could not continue to call professional interest, because professional interest did not look quite like that. "Maude," he said, and then stopped. It was the first time he had used her given name without the Mrs., and it sat in the room between them with the weight of a question. She looked at him steadily. "Mr. Alden," she said deliberately. "John," he said, "if you would." She considered him. This man had ridden 14 miles with her in her worst hour and asked for nothing. Had ridden to Fort Stockton and back in 11 days. Had eaten supper at the Harker table and brought her a book and sat on the porch with her in the evening and listened to her talk about the land with the same complete attention he gave to everything. "John," she said. It felt different, saying his given name. More honest somehow. He let out a breath, the particular breath of a man who has been holding something carefully for a long time. "I want to say something to you," he said. "And I want to say it carefully because I am aware that your husband has been gone barely 2 months and that you are in the middle of the hardest thing you have ever had to do, and I do not want to make any of that harder." Maude set down her coffee cup. "Say it," she said. He met her eyes. "I think you are the most remarkable person I have met," he said. "And I am aware that I have only known you a matter of weeks, and that reasonable people would say this is not the time or the circumstances for any kind of," he searched for the word, "declaration. But I find I cannot sit here and drink your coffee and look at the list of things you intend to fix in this cabin without telling you that I care about what happens to you. Beyond the investigation, beyond duty, I care because you are you." The silence in the cabin after he said that was full of the sound of the summer cicadas outside, the cattle somewhere south, the wind in the mesquite. Maude looked at her hands on the table. She thought about Roy, who had believed in things. She thought about the 18-year-old girl who had stood in her father's dry goods store and listened to a young man's plans and thought, "Here is a person worth building with." "I appreciate you saying it carefully," she said. "And I appreciate the honesty." She looked up. I am not in a position to," she stopped. Tried again. "You should not invest anything in this, John. The situation that brought you here is nearly resolved, and you have a post at Fort Stockton, and I have 240 acres and 20 head of cattle and a spring house door that is rotting at the bottom, and I am likely more trouble than anyone should take on voluntarily." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said something that she would carry with her for the rest of her life. "Maude," he said, "I have not counted the trouble, and I am not planning to." She looked at him. He held her gaze without flinching, without performing ease he did not feel. She could see that he meant it, plainly and entirely, the way he said everything. "I'm not a woman who needs rescuing," she said. "I want that to be entirely clear." "It is the clearest thing I know about you," he said, and he almost smiled. "I am not here to rescue you. I am here because I want to be. That is all." Maude Aldridge, who had held herself together through grief and threat and the long administrative labor of protecting what was hers, felt something give way in her chest, not dramatically, not in a way that involved tears, but quietly, the way a lock yields when you have the right key. "I will not make any promises," she said. "It is too soon and too complicated, and I am not a person who makes promises I do not know I can keep." "I am not asking for promises," he said. "I am asking if I can come back." She looked at him for a long moment. The afternoon light was coming through the clean window she had washed 2 days ago, falling on the table between them. "You can come back," she said. "John." He smiled then, a full smile, not the brief private one she had seen before, but a wide, genuine smile that changed his whole face and made him look younger and much more thoroughly human. And she found that she had to look away from it for a moment because it was rather a lot to take in all at once. The trial of Pete Rourke and Denny Walsh took place in September, in the county seat at Fort Stockton, which was the proper jurisdiction for a murder charge. Maude traveled there in a wagon with Will Harker as her driver, and she sat in the witness box on the second day and told the court exactly what she had seen, in the clear factual voice that was her natural register. And she did not cry, and she did not look down. And the prosecuting attorney told her afterward that she was the strongest witness he had put in front of a jury in 10 years of practice. John was there too, testifying about his investigation, and their eyes met across the courtroom twice, and it was the most they communicated all day, but it was enough. Rourke and Walsh were convicted. Rourke received life imprisonment. Walsh received 20 years. The judge made a specific note on the record about the organized nature of the violence, which was useful for the ongoing case against Kettner. Walking out of the courthouse into the bright September morning, Maude felt the weight of Roy's death settle into its proper place, not gone, not reduced, but positioned. Justice had been imperfect as it always was, but it had been real. She would carry the grief for a long time yet. She also intended to carry on. John fell into step beside her on the courthouse steps, and he did not say anything for a moment, just walked with her across the wide, dusty square. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I am," she said. "I am genuinely all right." She paused. "Thank you for all of it." "The investigation is my job," he said. "You know that is not what I mean," she said. "Yes," he said. "I know." They ate supper together that evening at a restaurant in Fort Stockton that had tablecloths and candles and a menu written in ink on a proper card, which was considerably more formal than the Harker kitchen or Maude's cabin table. It felt different. She wore her better dress, the one she had not worn since Roy's funeral, and she had done her hair more carefully, and she was aware, sitting across from John Alden with the candlelight between them, that they had crossed some kind of threshold. He was aware of it too. She could tell by the way he was working at being casual, which was not his most natural mode. "You are trying to seem at ease," she said. He stopped cutting his chicken. "Is it that obvious?" "Only to someone who has been watching you closely enough to know what you look like when you actually are at ease," she said. He looked at her for a moment, and then the tension broke and he laughed, a real, open laugh, and she laughed too, and the evening took on a different quality after that, lighter and more honest. They talked for 3 hours. They talked about his brothers in Missouri and her father's store in San Antonio. They talked about cattle and law and the future of the territory. He told her about a case he had worked the year before, a missing persons case that had turned into something more complicated, and the way he told it she understood that he had a particular gift for understanding how things connected, how one thread pulled on another. She told him about the accounting system she had developed for the homestead, how she tracked the costs against the income against the projected growth, and she showed him the small notebook she carried, and he asked questions that demonstrated he was genuinely interested rather than politely tolerating. When they walked back to the hotel where she was staying, The night was cool and full of stars, and the streets of Fort Stockton were quiet, and at the door of the hotel he stopped and turned to look at her. "Maude," he said. "John," she said, and her voice was steady, which she was proud of because her heart was doing something considerably less steady. He reached out and took her hand, the way a man asks permission by the act of reaching, and then holds still to see the answer. She looked at his hand around hers, those large, work-worn hands, and then she looked at his face. She stepped closer, which was her answer, and he brought his free hand up and touched her face with a gentleness she had not expected from those hands, and he kissed her once, softly, in the way of a man who has been waiting and is in no hurry, who intends to do this properly and knows that properly sometimes means slowly. She kissed him back. It was the most honest thing she had done in months, honest and warm and real, standing on a hotel step in Fort Stockton under the Texas stars with the sound of distant cattle somewhere in the dark. She pulled back, and she said, "I want to be clear that I am not a woman who can be kissed on a hotel step and then conveniently managed." "I know," he said. "That is one of the reasons I kissed you on a hotel step." She pressed her lips together against a smile. "That does not entirely make sense." "No," he agreed. "But you know what I mean." She did. She went inside, and she lay in the hotel bed looking at the ceiling, and she felt Roy's absence and John's presence both at once, and she let herself feel both without needing to sort them into neat categories, because she was a practical woman, but she was also a human one, and the heart was not a ledger. The next months were a particular shape of courtship that fit the world they were in. John was still an active ranger with duties that pulled him away for weeks at a stretch. Maude was building her homestead back up, which was absorbing and demanding work that required her full attention. They wrote to each other, John in a clear, direct hand that matched his speech, Maude in the neat, precise script her father had drilled into her at the dry goods store. The letters were not love letters exactly, not in the flowery sense. They were reports, mostly, what had happened, what was happening, what was being thought and worked through. But they were honest in a way that felt intimate, because honesty between two people who mean each other something is always intimate. He came to the homestead when he could, which was most often on his way between assignments, riding the bay horse through the gate and finding her at whatever she was working at, the cattle, the garden, the accounts. The first time he came and found her on the roof of the cabin replacing a shingle that had cracked over the summer, he stopped at the gate and looked up at her with an expression she had become familiar with, somewhere between astonishment and admiration, and he said, "Do you need help?" "Not at the moment," she said, "but you could start a fire and put water on. I am nearly done here and I will want coffee." He started the fire and put water on, and they sat at the kitchen table with their coffee, and she told him about the heifer she had purchased and the new arrangement she had made with a buyer in Sanderson, and he told her about the Kettner case, which was slowly and satisfyingly unraveling. 3 of Kettner's associates had turned state's evidence in exchange for reduced sentences, and the attorneys in Austin were building toward a trial that could realistically happen by spring. "And after that," she said. "After Kettner is dealt with and the investigation is closed," he looked at her directly. "That depends," he said. "On what?" "On you." She was quiet for a moment, holding her coffee cup, looking at him. They had been in this courtship for 6 months by then, 6 months of letters and visits and long evenings on the porch watching the Texas sky go from blue to gold to purple. 6 months of learning each other in the practical, daily way of two people who are genuinely interested in who the other person is. She had watched him handle cattle when she had needed a second pair of hands and he happened to be there. He was competent, not expert, but he learned quickly and did what he was told without taking offense when she corrected his technique. She had watched him talk to the homesteaders who were testifying against Kettner, and she had seen the particular careful gentleness he brought to people who were frightened and needed to be helped toward courage. She had seen him furious exactly once, when he learned that Greer had been receiving payments from the Kettner outfit for years and had deliberately delayed investigating the homesteader complaints. a fury that was cold and precise and entirely directed toward action rather than drama. She had also watched him look at her, not the way some men looked at women assessing, possessing, performing interest. The way he looked at her was paying attention, really attending as if she were worth understanding. "I want to be honest with you about something," she said. "All right," he said. "I loved Roy. I am still grieving him. I expect I will be grieving him for a long time. Grief does not end on a schedule." She looked at her hands. I am honestly, genuinely already caring for you, not instead of Roy, not to replace him, but alongside the rest of it, which is complicated." "Life is complicated," he said simply. "I need you to understand that I will not be subsumed," she said. "This land is mine. This operation is mine. I have built it and I intend to go on building it. I need a partner, not a keeper." "I know who you are, Maude," he said. "I have been paying attention." She looked at him for a long moment. Outside, the evening was coming on and the cattle were moving to the south pasture, and the sky was doing the thing it did in Texas in November, turning colors that had no proper names, gold and copper and rose all at once. "Ask me then," she said, "if you are intending to ask me." He stood up from the table and she thought for a moment that he was going to make something elaborate of it, and she would have respected the effort. But she was quietly relieved when he simply came around the table and stood in front of her and said, plainly and directly, as was his way, "Marry me, Maude. I want to spend my life here, with you. I want to be the person you write to and the person who comes through the gate, and I want to work alongside you and argue with you about fence lines, and go to sleep knowing that you are the most remarkable thing in my life. Marry me." She stood up so that she was not looking up at him and he was not looking down at her, because she was not a woman who conducted important conversations from a disadvantage. "Yes," she said. "John, yes." He put his hands on her face, and she put her hands flat on his chest, and he kissed her with all the patience gone out of it, all the careful and deliberate slowness replaced by something that was simply real. And the Texas evening came in through the window with its impossible colors, and the cattle moved in the south pasture, and the homestead that had been built in loss and grief and determination was also, suddenly and completely, beginning to be something else. They were married in April of 1883, on a Saturday morning at the Sweetwater Creek Church with Reverend Mills officiating, and Martha Harker weeping happily in the front pew and Ben Harker shaking John's hand with the firmness of a man who has watched something develop and feels ownership over its eventual success. Will Harker stood up for John. Maude walked herself down the aisle because her father had died the previous winter, quietly, in San Antonio, and there was no one else, and she was not the kind of woman who needed to be delivered by another person. She wore a dress she had made herself from fabric she had ordered from the catalog, a deep blue, not white, because she was a widow and a practical woman, and she liked blue. John wore his best clothes, and he had polished his boots and combed his hair, and he was standing at the front of the church when she came in, and the look on his face when he saw her was the look of a man who cannot quite believe his good fortune and knows it and is grateful for it. He had left the Rangers 2 weeks before the wedding. It had been his decision, made after a long conversation with his captain and a longer conversation with Maude. He had applied for and received the position of deputy sheriff in Crockett County, a different job than Sheriff Greer's comfortable do-nothing version of the office, because Greer had been removed from his position by the county commissioners in February, once the full extent of his corruption in the Kettner matter became clear. The new sheriff was a man named Hartley, who was competent and honest, and he had wanted John as his deputy. The job meant John was based in Sweetwater Creek, which was 11 miles from the homestead, and they had worked out the logistics practically. John would keep a room in town for the nights when the work ran late, and the homestead would be the home. He rode out each evening when he could, and on the weekends, and over time the days in town grew shorter as he shifted his main working base closer to the homestead. The Kettner trial happened in May, 6 weeks after the wedding, and it was the trial that mattered most. Franklin Kettner was a wealthy man and he had expensive lawyers, but he had 3 associates who had turned state's evidence and the testimony of 8 homesteaders whose properties had been targeted, and a paper trail through the land office that was damning in its specificity. John testified for 4 hours. The jury deliberated for 2. Kettner was convicted on charges of conspiracy to commit murder, land fraud, and organized intimidation, and he was sentenced to 15 years in the state penitentiary. John came home that evening, and it was home, the Aldridge homestead, now as much his as hers, and Maude was sitting on the porch, and she looked at his face when he rode up the road, and she could read the verdict from 100 yards away, because she had been learning how to read him for nearly a year, and she was very good at it. She stood up and walked to the gate, and he swung down from the horse and they stood in the road, and he told her, and she put her forehead against his shoulder for a moment with her eyes closed, and he held her without saying anything because there was not much to say and some things were better held than spoken. "It does not bring Roy back," she said, against his shoulder. "No," he said, "it does not. But it is the right thing." "Yes," he said, "it is the right thing." She lifted her head and looked at him. "Come inside. I made a decent supper." He brought his horse to the barn and she went inside, and they ate at the kitchen table with the lamp lit and the spring dark outside, and they talked about nothing consequential, a steer that needed watching, a letter she had received from Roy's sister in Georgia, a road improvement project the county was discussing. Ordinary talk. The ordinary talk of 2 people building an ordinary life, which was in fact the most extraordinary thing in the world. Over the following 2 years, the Aldridge homestead grew into the Aldridge Alden operation, though they kept the original name on the deed, and in the ledgers because Maude was the one who had brought the land to the marriage, and she felt strongly about that, and John had never once suggested otherwise. They expanded the herd to 40 head. They hired a hand, a quiet Mexican man named Archero, who had been working odd jobs around the county, and who turned out to be the best cattle handler Maude had ever seen. They repaired and expanded the cabin, adding a proper second room and a real back porch, and they planted a kitchen garden that was the envy of every woman in Sweetwater Creek, because Maude had a gift for growing things that surprised even her. John continued as deputy sheriff, rising to sheriff when Hartley retired in 1884, which suited him because it gave him a legitimate position from which to continue the kind of slow, patient, careful work of building justice in a county that had not always had enough of it. He was good at the work, and he was known for the particular quality he had always had: the willingness to pay attention, to go the extra mile, to take trouble over things that other people might have let slide. There were difficulties, of course, because the world was not obliging enough to stop being difficult simply because 2 people had sorted themselves out. There was a dry spell in the summer of 1884 that cost them 3 head and half the garden. There was a dispute with a neighbor over a water right that required 2 months of careful legal maneuvering before it was resolved in their favor. There was a winter when John came home from a particularly hard case, a domestic situation in one of the outlying homesteads that had ended badly before he arrived, and he was quiet for 3 days in a way that was not his usual quiet, and Maude sat beside him on the porch on the 3rd evening and put her hand in his and did not ask him to explain, and eventually he began to talk, and she listened the way he had always listened to her, completely, without the impulse to fix or redirect, just present with the thing that needed to be heard. He told her about it, and she understood that in his work he saw the worst of what people could do to each other, and that the weight of that was real and cumulative, and that the thing that helped him carry it was coming home to the solid, particular reality of the homestead and of her. "I sometimes feel as though you are the only thing I am entirely sure about," he said. "Everything else has the quality of contingency. It might go one way or another. You are the fixed thing." "You should not need me to be a fixed thing," she said. "You are allowed to be uncertain sometimes." "I am." "I know," he said, "but you manage it with such extraordinary competence that it is hard to tell." She looked at him sideways. "That is possibly the most flattering thing anyone has ever said to me." He brought her hand up and pressed his mouth to her knuckles briefly, the way he sometimes did, which she had decided was the most unexpectedly tender gesture in his extensive repertoire of understated tenderness. "I love you, Maude," he said, plainly, the way he said everything that mattered. "I love you, John," she said. It was the truest thing she knew. By 1885, Maude was 25 years old and the homestead was running at a genuine profit for the first time. The herd stood at 45 head. Archero had taken on a second hand, a young man from San Antonio who reminded Maude of Roy in the way he looked at the land, as if it were something worth believing in. The kitchen garden had been expanded, and she had started selling surplus to the store in Sweetwater Creek, which was a small thing but was hers, and she kept a separate ledger for it because she kept a ledger for everything. In the fall of that year, she told John that she thought she might be pregnant. He was sitting at the kitchen table reading the county paper, and she said it as plainly as she told him everything, standing in the kitchen doorway with her hands in her apron, and he put the paper down and looked at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before, something so unguarded and raw and completely transparent that she almost looked away from it. He crossed the kitchen in 2 steps and put his arms around her and held on, and she could feel that he was not entirely steady, and she put her hand on the back of his neck and said, "I am not completely certain yet. I wanted to tell you when I thought it was likely." "It is all right," he said, muffled into her hair. "It is more than all right." She pulled back enough to look at his face. His gray eyes were bright in a way she had not seen before, and she thought that he was one of those people who hold a great deal inside without showing it, and that when the great deal came out it was overwhelming in its sincerity. "Are you crying, John Alden?" she said. "I am considering it," he said. "I am at the stage of very seriously considering it." She laughed, which was entirely unexpected, and he laughed too, and the kitchen was full of it, the laugh, the light, the spring evening coming through the window. She was, in fact, pregnant. The doctor in Sweetwater Creek confirmed it in November, and by the spring of 1886 she was large and somewhat less mobile than her preference, which she found genuinely irritating, and she said so on several occasions. And John listened to her frustrations about her own physical limitations with the same careful attention he gave to everything, and the occasional observation that she was handling everything remarkably well, which she did not entirely believe but appreciated him saying. The child was born on a warm morning in April of 1886, with Martha Harker in attendance and the Sweetwater Creek doctor standing by, and John was outside the room walking a small circle in the kitchen, because he had been told to stay out, and had obeyed that instruction on the strict understanding that someone would tell him what was happening at regular intervals, which Martha did by opening the door every 15 minutes and reporting progress. The child was a boy. 7 pounds, healthy, with his father's gray eyes and his mother's dark hair. They named him Roy John Alden, because Maude wanted Roy's name to continue, and John had agreed immediately, and without any need for discussion, because he understood why without being told. John held the baby in the first hour with the complete absorbed attention of a man encountering something that has reorganized every prior category, and the baby looked up at him with the blurry, unfocused gaze of a creature very recently arrived in the world, and John said, barely audibly, "Hello, Roy. I am going to make sure you know about your father. He was a man who believed in things, and that matters." Maude heard this from the bed across the room, and she closed her eyes for a moment with the specific sweetness of a feeling she could not have named before she knew him. Martha Harker, on her way out, passed through the room and looked at the 3 of them together and said, to no one in particular, "Good Lord, what a sight," in the tones of someone who is finding the world unexpectedly satisfactory. The years that followed were the kind of years that do not lend themselves to drama, which is its own kind of happiness. Roy John Alden grew from a baby into a toddler into a small boy with his mother's directness and his father's patience, which was a formidable combination that got him both into and out of considerable amounts of trouble. He loved the cattle with the wholehearted devotion of the very young, and Archero took to teaching him the trade with the gentle seriousness of a man who considers it important work. In 1888, Maude was pregnant again. This time she was more comfortable with the process, more familiar with her own body's management of it, and she continued to work through most of the pregnancy with accommodations she had worked out logically, certain tasks delegated, others modified, the accounts done at the kitchen table instead of in the barn office. John watched her with the particular combination of pride and worry that she had come to recognize as his permanent mode of existence regarding her, and she told him periodically that she was not made of china, and he said he knew that. No one knew that better than he did, and she told him that knowing it and behaving accordingly were two different things. The second child was a girl, Elizabeth Maude Alden, born in the spring of 1888, and from her first week of life she had opinions about everything and expressed them with considerable volume. Maude looked at this baby, this furious, determined small creature, and thought, "Yes, there you are." Roy was 2 years old and regarded his sister with the solemn curiosity of a small person deciding what he thinks about a major development. He concluded, after about a week, that she was acceptable, and from that point he showed the kind of older sibling protectiveness that would drive Elizabeth to absolute distraction in about 10 years, but which was for now entirely charming. By 1890, the Aldridge Alden operation had grown to 65 head of cattle, a proper working ranch in all but name. John was in his third term as county sheriff, re-elected twice by margins that said something about what the county thought of him. Archero had been with them 8 years and was, by any practical measure, part of the family. The cabin had been extended a second time, proper bedrooms for both children, a sitting room that served as a library on account of the books Maude and John had accumulated, and a porch that wrapped 3/4 of the way around the structure. The porch was where they spent their evenings mostly. Summer and winter, morning and night, they found their way to the porch at some point in the day. It was where they talked about the operation and the law and the county, where they read aloud to each other and to the children, where they watched the Texas sky do its extravagant daily performance of color and light. One evening in the fall of 1890, with the children in bed and the night coming in over the mesquite, John sat on the porch step and Maude sat on the bench behind him, and she was braiding her hair for bed, which she did out here in the warm evenings, and the lamp inside cast a soft light through the window. "I have been thinking," he said. "I know," she said. "You have been quiet for 3 days." "Have I?" He looked mildly surprised. "I did not notice." "You never do," she said. "What have you been thinking about?" He was quiet for another moment. Then, "I was thinking about the day I rode up to your wagon, on the road to Sweetwater Creek." Maude's hands went still in her hair. "I was thinking about how I almost did not take that road," he said. "I was coming from Fort Stockton and I had the choice of the southern road, which was an hour shorter. I took the northern road because I thought I saw a dust cloud that looked wrong." He paused. "If I had taken the southern road, you would not have found us," she said. "No," he was quiet. "I have thought about that a lot over the years." Maude sat for a moment with her hands loose in her hair and the warm night all around her. She thought about the road. She thought about the 14 miles of dust and Roy in the wagon and the terrible emptiness of that afternoon. She thought about the bay horse coming around the bend with the careful gray-eyed man on its back. "I am glad you took the northern road," she said. "Yes," he said. "So am I, more than I can tell you." She finished braiding her hair and tied it, and then she moved from the bench to the step and sat beside him, and he put his arm around her without thinking about it. The unconscious ease of two people who have been beside each other long enough that it is simply where their bodies expect to be. "I told you, on that day in the cabin," she said, "that I was probably more trouble than anyone should take on voluntarily." "I remember," he said. "I still think there is some argument to be made for that position," she said. "I am not what anyone would call easy." "No," he agreed, and she could hear the smile in it. "And you said you had not counted the trouble and were not planning to." "Yes," he said, "I meant that." She looked at the dark shapes of the mesquite against the stars. "Have you ever counted it?" she asked. In retrospect, he was quiet for a moment and she could feel him genuinely considering the question, which was how he considered everything. "No," he said finally. "It is not the kind of thing I think about in those terms. Trouble implies something I would rather not have done. I would do all of it again. Even the 14 miles of dust with a grieving stranger and a body in the wagon. Especially that," he said. "That was when I knew." She turned to look at him. The lamplight from the window fell across his face, the lean jaw, the sun-worn skin, the gray eyes that were looking at her with the same careful, complete attention they always had, the attention that had never once wavered in all the years she had been knowing him. "What did you know?" she asked. "That you were worth every mile of road I was ever going to travel," he said, "and every mile I had already traveled, and that I was not going to count any of them." Maude Aldridge, who had become Maude Alden and who was both people at once, because a life does not require you to stop being what you were in order to become what you are, looked at this man and felt the particular fullness of a life that had been hard and was also genuinely and completely good. "I love you," she said. Simply, the way he taught her by example to say the things that mattered. "I love you, Maude," he said. They sat on the porch for another hour while the stars moved overhead the way they always had, indifferent to human drama and human joy alike, and the cattle were quiet in the south pasture, and the children slept in the cabin, and the lamp burned steady in the window, and the night was warm and full and entirely, perfectly sufficient. 3 more years passed with the steady rhythm of a well-run operation and a well-tended love. Roy grew to be 6 and then 7, and could work cattle with a competence that pleased Archero and amused his father. Elizabeth grew to be 4 and then 5, and was by universal consensus the most opinionated child in Crockett County, which everyone said about their own children, but which was genuinely more true in this case. She had decided at age 4 that she wanted to know how to read, and had informed her mother of this decision with the directness of someone who expects cooperation from the universe. And Maude had begun teaching her from the same basic text she had learned from and found, somewhat to her surprise, that she loved teaching with the same completeness that she loved everything she was good at. In the spring of 1893, Maude discovered she was expecting a 3rd child. She was 33, which was not unusual for a 3rd pregnancy in that era, and she was in excellent health from the physical life of the ranch, and the pregnancy was straightforward from the beginning. She told John over breakfast, the way she told him everything now, directly, without preamble, across the kitchen table with the morning coffee between them. He looked at her and a smile spread across his face, slow and deep, the smile she had come to know as his most real one. "Maude," he said. "I know," she said. "3," he said. "Can you count?" she said affectionately. He reached across the table and took her hand and held it, and that was all, and it was enough. The 3rd child was another boy, born in November of 1893, and they named him James. James Alden had his grandmother's dark eyes, the German-Mexican combination that had given Maude her own coloring, and from his first weeks, he seemed to take everything with a philosophical tranquility that was the opposite of his sister Elizabeth and the complement to his brother Roy. He was a placid, interested child who observed the world around him with evident satisfaction, and he was 4 months old before Elizabeth decided she approved of him, and 6 months old before Roy declared him an acceptable addition to the household. Martha Harker, at the baby's christening, held James and looked at Maude with bright eyes and said, "Look at what you have made." Maude looked around the churchyard, at Roy running after a beetle with complete dedication, at Elizabeth standing in front of Ben Harker explaining something about the bell tower at length and volume, at John talking to Reverend Mills with James's christening blanket still visible over his arm, at Archero standing with the horses with the quiet, dignified presence he always had. She looked at the church and the Sweetwater Creek Main Street, and the road beyond it that she had driven into town on a June evening 11 years ago with the worst thing she had ever been through happening around her. And she looked at all of it and she thought, this was the thing that had been built. She went to John and he put his free arm around her and she leaned against his side, not heavily but solidly, the way two things lean against each other when they have found their right position. "All right," he murmured. "Better than all right," she said. "John, we are better than all right." He pressed his mouth to the top of her head, the way he sometimes did, the gesture that meant I know, and I am glad, and I am here, all at once. And they were. They were better than all right. The homestead continued to expand over the following years, the herd growing, the land worked with the combination of Maude's systematic accounting and John's understanding of water rights and county policy and Archero's pure cattleman's knowledge. The children grew up in the specific freedom of children raised on a working ranch, with responsibilities and physical confidence, and a knowledge of how the world worked at its practical level that their town contemporaries did not always have. Roy, at 10, was a capable rider and a thoughtful observer of cattle health. Elizabeth, at 8, had read everything in the cabin library and was writing letters to the Sweetwater Creek schoolteacher, asking for more books with the imperious confidence of a person who has always been taken seriously. James, at 5, had discovered that he was interested in growing things and had established a small personal garden adjacent to his mother's, which he tended with the same philosophical tranquility with which he approached everything. John, at 43, was still the Crockett County sheriff, though he had recently begun to say to Maude in private that he thought he might stand down at the next election in favor of a younger man, not because he was tired exactly, but because the county was in a stable place now, and the work of building something sound had been done, and he was increasingly interested in being home more. Maude, at 37, was running the best operation in Crockett County by any objective measure, which was an assessment that several people had made out loud and in public, and which she received with the particular combination of satisfaction and already looking to what comes next. That was her permanent mode. On a morning in the fall of 1897, Maude was at the kitchen table with her ledgers, the cattle accounts, the garden accounts, the household accounts, all in their separate notebooks, all current to within the week, and John was on the porch with his coffee and the county paper. The children were at their various occupations. James was in his garden. Roy had ridden out with Archero to check the north fence line. Elizabeth was, as far as anyone could determine, in her room reading. John came to the kitchen door and looked at her. She looked up. "This is a good life," he said. She put down her pen. She considered the ledgers on the table. She looked at her husband in the kitchen doorway, with his coffee and his worn hat and the gray in his dark blonde hair that was more present now than it had been, and the same gray eyes that had looked at her carefully and completely since the first moment they had found her. "Yes," she said. "John, it is." She went to the door and he made room for her and she stepped out onto the porch beside him, into the Texas morning, the vast clear sky, the distant cattle, the smell of sage and earth, and in the garden below the porch, James crouching over his seedlings with absorbed concentration. She put her hand in John's, and he closed his fingers around it, and they stood on the porch of the homestead that she had built and fought for and kept, and they looked at the morning coming over the land, and it was everything. It was the whole of it. It was the trouble counted, and the road taken, and the life built from the ground up by two people who had found each other on a dusty road in the worst hour of one of them, and had taken the other measure, the longer measure, the one that does not deal in trouble at all, but only in where you want to be. Here, John Alden had said, in everything but words from that first afternoon. Here, Maude Aldridge had answered in time. And here they were.